Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Innovation, the Future of Sustainable Cities, our One World Festival event. We're looking forward to hearing from our speakers as they explore the role innovation will play in the future of housing. Our vision at Habitat for Humanity is a world where everyone has a safe place to live. The reality that more than 1.6 billion people in our world lack adequate shelter should challenge us all to find new ways to break down barriers, to innovate, and to advocate so that every person has a home. Housing can ensure sustainable development. It's a driver and a contributor for 13 of the 17 SDGs, a multiplier of community jobs and income, and essential for inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable cities. Throughout the session, if you have any questions, please insert them in the Q&A function on your screen. We will direct them to our panelists towards the end of the session. Please do post on social media, tag us at Habitat NI, and use the hashtag Habitat Innovation. I'm so thankful to the three speakers who have agreed to give up their time to join us today. I'm very pleased to introduce our first guest speaker, Habitat colleague, Jennifer Oomen. Jennifer is the Director of Applied Innovation at Habitat's Terwilliger Centre for Innovation in Shelter, where she leads global efforts to seed and support inclusive business ideas to test innovative, sustainable models to address affordable housing. Jennifer, who is based in Amsterdam, has more than 13 years experience applying market systems, human-centered designs, and systems thinking in projects globally. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And I'm very excited to be here today and share with you a little bit about how Habitat is approaching innovation for affordable housing. You can go to the next slide, Rebecca. To kind of ground us in this subject, I want to introduce you to Ed and Gina. This is Ed and Gina. He's a tricycle driver. She works in a sari-sari store, a small shop. They live in Mactan, Cebu in the Philippines. And it's located on the Pacific Ring of Fire. It's a part of the world that's regularly pummeled by not only a yearly monsoon season, also rising sea levels, regular earthquakes, and also landslides. Ed and Gina build and rebuild the way most people do between yearly typhoons. They build a home made from cement block with no foundation, with iron sheets for roofing, and have completed this over the course of the last 20 years, improving when money is available to them because they're actually excluded from the formal banking system. Ed and Gina recognize that actually in an earthquake, it's better to run out of the house than to stay in, given the lack of a foundation. They take pride in their home, but they have generally been excluded from the formal housing market. Ed and Gina are what makes up the invisible segment. Next slide, Rebecca. Thanks. They're part of the unserved housing market on the left side. If you can click again. There are 13.2 million Filipinos that make up that are part of the unserved market. And yet there's $13 billion market value. And we actually estimated in a recent study conducted by Habitat's Terwilliger Center that there's $29 billion in GDP undercount because the government simply does not track this sort of incremental builder experience like Ed and Gina. And we actually find that this is a conservative estimate. So millions of households face these sort of similar challenges. Access to housing finance, access to quality materials and services. And that's not just the physical material, but also the design, architecture, services that one might experience or use or utilize in other markets, but also information about resilient design, about resilient construction, and also persistent and embedded sort of social norms that dictate how you build, what materials you use, and therefore how strong or how durable or long-lasting your house may be. So Habitat, in the face of this, sort of posed this question to ourselves. How can we get private sector actors to realize the market of this invisible segment? And how can they help to be part of the solution to actually meaningfully reduce the housing deficit in places like the Philippines? The Philippines is the example. Ed and Gina are the family that I'm using as the example, but this example can be applied in many geographies across the world. What we find is actually that the private sector doesn't actually view, that we call them invisible because they don't see them and they don't create value for them the way they do maybe at the high income segment. So keeping that in mind, we also have to acknowledge that people like Ed and Gina are the most vulnerable and oftentimes the most impacted by climate change. At the same time, the buildings and construction sector is a critical piece towards a low carbon future. It's a heavily carbon intensive market or sector. And there's a lot of potential innovation that can be part of the solution there. Entrepreneurial solutions, if you can go back, thanks, in shelter oftentimes target an upper or upper middle income segment, a more formal housing market. While at the lower end, the affordable segment will lack access to the adequate or interesting innovations or solutions. When they do actually go down market, they're met with messy systems, informal or lots of informality, and potentially lots of unclear government regulation or even red tape. But entrepreneurs that want to be part of the solution need support to navigate the market. And I think that startups and entrepreneurs play a very important role to solving, obviously, the world's toughest challenges. And so there's an opportunity, we have an opportunity to really unlock some of those innovation enablers to create real impact in the housing market and do that at scale. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the type of companies that Habitat has been accelerating and investing in with our impact investment fund, and the type of solutions that we see as promising in these geographies. You can go to the next. Let me give you first one, ModRoof. This is one of my favorites. We've been working with ModRoof since the beginning of our impact investment fund, Shelter Venture Fund. They were one of our first investees. And ModRoof is taking scrap cardboard and natural binders and creating lightweight panels that are modular in nature. And they are insulated, they're waterproofed, and they can make a home 5 degrees cooler in the very hot Indian summers. They're also quieter in against a monsoon rain. The panels are made to be strong, fireproof, long-lasting. It decreases the maintenance needed for these materials. They're also, at the end of life, 90% of the panel is actually recyclable, decreasing waste. Families that want to build upward can also remove these roofs, add on a second or third story, and then reinstall the roof. They also create productive space for houses. So in this picture, you don't see that some people have added a railing around and use it to dry laundry and whatnot on the top of the home, which is common practice. So ModRoof has been able to work with Habitat for Humanity through our Shelter Venture Fund, and is scaling up these solutions and accelerating these solutions into informal communities in northern India. Next. The second example I want to give is Earth Enable, another Shelter Venture Fund investee, this time based out of Rwanda. And 75% of Rwandans are living in homes that have dirt floors, but a cement floor upgrade can actually be an unattainable step. So Earth Enable was inspired to say, well, what's the incremental step for a household that doesn't have as much access to maybe formal housing finance? What can we do? And so they've made these resin floors that are sealed and waterproof, so you can sit and cook and eat and live in this space, but it's not going to cost as much as it would to upgrade your floor to cement. Next. Our third example is Jijenge in Kenya. We've been working with Jijenge since 2018, since 2017, actually, when they attended our Kenyan accelerator. And they are taking plastic waste and mixing it into a brick product, and addressing both the issue of building materials and waste in their own communities. So all of these innovations are interesting and exciting on their own, but they require a supportive, enabling environment around them in order to be successful in the market. Next slide, Rebecca. The change that we have in mind is that in order to positively influence innovators to come and enter into this space, and we have to reduce the barriers to entry. That's one. We have to also create an enabling environment through standards that support innovation, regulations that are clear, a building code that allows new entrants in hard technology. And finally, those regulations have a huge impact on whether or not social norms for material innovation are actually, uptaken by others in the market. And so Habitat has not just focused our time and effort on supporting individual entrepreneurs, but also stepping back and looking at the system in a country and saying, let's work on these regulations, let's work on R&D facilities, let's look at standards together and make sure that those are complementary and not disincentivizing. There's lots of talk about innovation. There's lots of tech accelerators out there. If we want people, young people, to come and put their minds towards solving the housing deficit or bringing new innovations into the market, it can't be, it can't be an experience that is very, negative and disincentivizing. So, last slide, please. Next, thanks. So, Habitat for Humanity, we're one of the largest global shelter organizations operating in over 70 country contexts around the world. The Terwilliger Center created Shelter Tech to really develop entrepreneurs and incentivize entrepreneurship. We also have our Shelter Venture Fund that invests in catalytic startups who are ready for an impact investment. And, these types of programs allow innovation to flourish and grow. And we really look forward to partnership with local universities, global communities, in order to push these startups, push these innovations and get them to market to those who need access to safe, durable housing. I'll pause there for questions.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. It's always encouraging and exciting to see how small changes can have a big impact, but also how Habitat is very focused not just on the innovation, but also in embedding the innovation within the norms and changing the systems which will allow the innovation to flourish. So thank you for that. Can I remind you that if you have any questions for Jennifer, do pop them in the Q&A now while you remember them, and then we will ask those of Jennifer later. So thank you so much, Jennifer. Our next speaker is Professor Tom Jeffries, who's Professor of Future Cities at Queen's University Belfast. Professor Jeffries is a prize-winning architect and urban designer, previously head of the Manchester and Birmingham Schools of Architecture. His wide-ranging trans-sectoral experience, practice, and interdisciplinary research is the basis for proposing radical symbiotic forms of future urbanism and architecture. Over to you, Tom, and thanks again for being with us.
Well, thanks for the invite and the opportunity to talk about the work we're doing. So if we could have the first slide, please, that would be fantastic. What I'm going to do today is talk about themes and ideas that we're exploring, and these are examples taken from the Masters Design Studio that I work with, looking at issues to do with contemporary urban space, the real challenges around urbanization, and how we address big questions around sustainability, urban and societal resilience, and decarbonisation, and really how we develop expertise and knowledge, applicable knowledge within that kind of space. I think there's a big thing about developing design thinking as a mechanism to unpack really complex, wicked problems, and propose ways through those that can make people's lives better. And I think we've seen over the past 20 months or so the importance of building resilience as a kind of complex set of interacting factors that are both qualitative and quantitative to allow people to cope with shock and stress. And you know, COVID, if anything, has produced a large degree of that. So go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as it said previously, you know, the world is rapidly urbanizing. 65 or 68% of the world will be urban, and there are kind of questions really around what that entails. So part of the work that we're involved with is producing research, looking at the kind of limits and approaches to this new kind of paradigm, if you like, and actually asking whether things always have to be the same, and how we can introduce change, and also how we can pull together different sectors, different sets of knowledge, different kind of professional and societal groups to produce innovation and impact, in terms of rethinking about what the future might be, and essentially using that design thinking process to unlock problems that seem insoluble. So if we go to the next slide, please. So one of the questions I have is, and this is a kind of fundamental question, is the city actually a problem that can be solved? Or is it a kind of condition that we engage with and manipulate and sort of recognize has a sort of momentum of its own? So one of the real, I think it's a kind of fairly fundamental thing is deproblematizing challenges. And asking what the notion of kind of luxury is as a mechanism to produce change. Human beings like luxury, I think that's clear. So the question is how we actually articulate that. Now, what we have here is images of 4 ideal settlements that were created with the intention of using collective power. In these cases, they're all based around industrial works, but using the idea of the collective whole to produce benefit for the individual. And this can manifest itself in fantastic architecture. Anybody who's been to Saltaire over in Yorkshire on a sunny day, it's just an amazing place. It can be to objectively use good design to raise standards. So residents of Port Sunlight back in the turn of the 19th, 20th century had a life expectancy of more than 10 years more than people living over the water in Liverpool, due to the design of that place and the introduction of facilities to support the workforce. So there's a kind of bigger piece here about how we use design as a kind of complex set of multiple interacting systems manifest through something spatialized and formal, to project ideas about what the city could and should be. And this engages with innovative material practice. And I think the examples that were shown in the previous presentation are kind of very cool, actually. A few years ago, we did a kind of experiment with rammed earth, looking at it as a potential housing material, and the things you can and can't do with it are kind of fascinating. But the idea of innovative material practice and shared societal goals is key. Next slide, please. And this needs to come from a strong data-driven and evidence base. I think so. What we have here is some of the work we did looking at mappings of Northern Ireland, looking at various capacities, and multiple mappings here. So the top left-hand one's about water, the bottom left-hand one is about wind energy in the Mournes. The two middle ones are about mobility structures within the whole of the island of Ireland. The grid-based ones are around planting densities for various crop types. That was part of a project to reimagine Cookstown. And then on the slide on the right is looking at the amount of space £100,000 buys you in various places across the UK. Look at the differentiations. So we're starting to unpack through analysis of data and spatializing that data, the differences and similarities between various places, the ability to then cross-cut and interconnect kind of thematic unpackings of that data allows us to produce insights and sort of evidence things that are kind of implicit but not explicit sometimes. And this can be used in all sorts of really interesting and powerful ways to expose inequalities, but also to produce the context for opportunity and development and innovation. Next slide, please. And sometimes it's really useful to actually present alternative versions of reality to allow you to question what you're kind of used to. The notion of the model city is one that's quite an interesting test case. And in this case, what we can see is an 18th century idealized late agrarian community model applied to Northern Ireland. This is the city of Show, which was a model town developed in post-revolutionary France. 1,400 shows fit the population of Northern Ireland pretty much. So we could, if we wanted to, replan Northern Ireland in a completely idealized pattern, engaging agrarian practice. Now, you can then start to say, well, okay, within the context of what we've got, do these models allow us to unlock different versions of how things can be organized and operated on? And I think this is the notion of using utopias to test everyday life is a very, very useful and powerful tool if it's deployed correctly. So if we go to the next slide, please. Also, very, very critically, it's about visualizing the invisible. The climate emergency is something that's really, really facing us four square. And I think one of the things about we see in bodies like COP26 is groups trying to get around the table and produce resolution. And part of the problem with things like the climate emergency is that the challenge is so big and kind of invisible that how do we actually know what we're looking for? And this is a little demonstration we did last year using Rathlin Island to visualize the amount of carbon that Northern Ireland produces annually. So if you turn the carbon into soot, you get a pyramid of Giza of soot a year. I do like the idea of alternative forms of measurement. You know, football pitches, Olympic swimming pools, and pyramids of Giza are useful in terms of communicating the nature of the challenge that we actually face, rather than X gigatons, which are kind of meaningless. So actually, part of this is about visualizing and communicating challenges and looking at how that can then be used to frame opportunities. So next slide, please. Also looking at how technology, widely dispersed technology, can help citizens to re-engage with places, and how we could reimagine movement systems within places we live. So this is looking at how drone last mile delivery might take place within Belfast, in a world where we're no longer allowed to burn coal in our fireplaces. We can actually deliver parcels down the chimney via drone. So Santa comes every day in the future, which is kind of a neat idea, I thought. Next slide, please. How we articulate the expression of culture and diversity is kind of critical as well. So what are the possibilities for us to reimagine our cities as places of celebrated diversity, and how does that manifest itself through the day-to-day reality of the material presence of aspects of our lived environments? Here we see Great Victoria Street in Belfast repositioned through the international dimension of Northern Ireland, made evident through the patterns on the pavement. Next, please. How do we introduce new net zero technologies in ways that are responsive to heritage and responsive to culture? I think there's a really interesting piece around the longevity of certain forms of traditional craft that have been going for many, many thousands of years, something like the dry stone wall, for example, and the speed with which contemporary technology and the kind of challenge of embedding contemporary technology within these traditional landscapes and features. So here we can see an experiment which was trying to introduce the solar wall into a context, in this case the Mournes, to say there are areas which are highly controlled in terms of their visual characteristics. How do we engage with that control and produce something that is both beautiful and contemporary, but also sits within a kind of 3,000-year history of dry stone wall building? And I think this is a strategy that's applicable in multiple situations. One of the things that strikes me about self-built communities globally, low-income communities globally, is their kind of similarity, the aesthetic similarities. And there's a piece of work, I think, to unpack what that means, unpack what the new vernacular might be, and have a look at how incremental improvements to that produce large improvements for human inhabitation. Next slide, please. And we're also very interested in the notion of taking existing situations and transforming them through rethinking at multiple scales and using multiple kind of cultural, environmental strategies and tactics. This was a project we looked at to reimagine the British Antarctic research station, enveloping it in a glazed structure, but working out from the perspective of the kind of four-poster bed almost as a series of nested layers within the context of the Antarctic space. Now, this kind of strategy can be applied not only in extreme environments like the Antarctic, but closer to home in terms of reimagining how we live in our houses, for sure within the UK, but more widely. And I think the piece about reimagining what the floor surface finish was in that project earlier was fantastic. But through a simple change, you can produce significant affordances in terms of the capacity of a built environment to perform. And the final slide, please. So the importance of this is that we introduce the ability for environments to absorb shock and become resilient. And we've seen this in the past year or so with the pandemic. This is some research we did comparing experiences of inhabitants of Wuhan in China with inhabitants of Manchester in the UK. And there are common themes that exist globally. There is a common theme that you need to have agency and choice in terms of how you define your domestic environment, in terms of what you can do in it. So the ability to carve out spaces within a domestic environment that can accommodate different uses very easily is significantly important. So how we then go forwards and design our houses, building that in becomes a significantly important factor, not just a nice to have. And the other thing that became very, very evident is the ability to access high quality natural space, both as a kind of psychological release valve, but also as a mechanism to connect and ground yourself with some kind of longer time scale, connecting with the seasons and so on and so forth. And I think the reimagining a synergy of lived place and nature is going to be critical to the design of 21st century urban space. Trashing nature to produce, urban settlements, I think, is something which will definitely need to be revisited at a kind of fundamental level. Okay, so that's it. Thank you. I think the last slide is just a thank you slide. So if you could go on to that one, that'd be great. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about the work. Do appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Tom. I'm going to remember visualizing the invisible. And especially since I travelled to Rathlin this summer, I will not easily forget the Pyramid of Giza on Rathlin. So thank you, that really interesting, challenging thoughts. Really appreciate you being with us. Our final speaker of the day is local architect Murray Bell. Principal of Bell Architects, Murray has for 30 years explored the challenge of ecological architectural design with a sustainable emphasis. And I loved that you said, Murray, with a communitarian heart. In housing, Murray led the practice that delivered Northern Ireland's first zero carbon home in 2007, and more recently designed single person accommodation for urgent need, as well as innovative micro houses which could be made locally and affordably. Bell Architects are also working with the design of Northern Ireland's first co-housing site in Portaferry. Over to you, Murray, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jenny. And thank you to the other speakers, especially. I think it's wonderful to have a time like this to explore and think and come up with ideas. Thank you for the opportunity for all who are listening in to join in as well. I think the reason that architects do what we do, or maybe why I do what I do, is because we like solving puzzles. The puzzle of housing continually afflicts our society, whether in a city or rural environment. I believe that we have the tools to solve this puzzle, but that greed and bureaucracy are often the killers of innovation in housing. Sorry, that's the second slide. So it's the third slide. So go back. Yes, thank you. In 2007, this was Northern Ireland's first zero carbon home in Hollywood, achieved using SIP panels, high performance walling system with quite a few gadgets. In fact, quite an enormous number of gadgets. Ulster University were involved in monitoring and assessing, and the house received much coverage in the press and TV at the time. An exciting exemplar, but not particularly affordable. Why did it not become mainstream? And why did people still not care about their house energy performance? And why is there still a general disinterest in SAP and performance in terms of energy? Next slide, thanks. In 2008, we designed and oversaw the Steeple Road Antrim housing site. It was a housing association, a modular housing development with houses arriving on the backs of trucks. We've all heard that modular is the way forward, and perhaps more so now with the challenges of worker shortages and material expense. But what happened? Why has modular not become mainstream even yet? It certainly has grown in significance, but it's not mainstream. The company behind this modular experiment failed, and the site sat inactive for several years. The remaining site was built out using standard build formats. Only 5 or 6 of the houses succeeded as modular. Again, perhaps a failure based on greed, complexity, and perhaps bureaucracy. Next slide, please. Disappointingly, the remainder of the development progressed without the innovations that were envisaged at inception. The development is complete, but was it a success or a partial success or indeed a partial failure? Next slide, thanks. In 2009, we began developing quickroom.com, a disabled bedroom extension concept that allowed an extremely viable concept to solve the problem of disability adaptations to housing in Northern Ireland. To this date, the process of achieving a disability adaptation onto a dwelling has to be one of the most tortured processes that we've ever experienced. We offer to do two free adaptations using our concept, and it was never taken up on. No learning, no progress. A few years ago, we were quietly sidelined in a disability adaptation because we raised the prospect of doing the most for a user, not the minimum. Next slide, please. The problem of additions and extensions to dwellings is exacerbated with process and bureaucracy. When we first started developing the Quick Room concept, it was a direct response to the need for a speedy solution. A housing association at the time contacted us looking for a quick room. They were already 18 months into the process of providing a bedroom for a family who had a sick parent, bed and everything in the kitchen, because there was nowhere else for him to go. We provided quick ideas and options, but a couple of weeks later, he died in his kitchen. Who really cares about these simple needs and who is actually going to make a difference. Next slide. In 2010, we worked on a new concept of live-work dwellings, something that has perhaps come back into conversation post-COVID. The ability to work close to home, but not in your home, downstairs in a workspace that connects to the street. Living above the shop or above the workplace can become real again in our town centres. However, we have to be careful that we don't start knocking everything down to build new. Scrutiny is now quite rightly being put to the benefit of embodied carbon in existing buildings, and this is quite correct, but we need to be smarter in our modifications. Next slide, thanks. In 2014, we explored single-person emergency accommodation, which were pods above car parking spaces or above enclosed garden spaces. One of the biggest needs, as far as we are aware, is single-person accommodation, and we realized that land costs is often the block to development in this sector. We came up with the idea of one-person pods or parent and child pods above parking spaces or back garden community spaces as an interim measure to help provide needy housing with no land cost. We consider this to be an experiment well worth developing, and we're keen to explore this in the coming year. When I returned to Glasgow to visit family, these backland areas behind and enclosed by tenements in flatted squares are generally completely empty, unloved, and available for a few of these housing units. Next slide, please. 2019 was a focus on micro homes, developing small homes that could meet the need for a couple with child or an elderly couple. They don't need much space and don't need much garden. Surely we could come up with an interesting dwelling that provides inside and outside space to meet a need. Some of these ideas moved sideways into the holiday home market, and there's much to be learned from this sector. Next slide. 2020 was the beginning of the glamping extravaganza, beyond micro housing and into micro homes that can serve as temporary or short-term accommodation, not requiring planning permission or building control, exempt dwellings, or exempt accommodation. These we developed with Taggart Homes in Derry, and they're proving to be sensational on social media. They look delightful and are fun to live in, and yet they are attractive and affordable. Surely those that are in difficult circumstances deserve to live in something which is attractive and affordable more than bare function. Next slide, please. As another illustration, the importance in small or micro housing is that the outside space is as important and a part of the design. This outside space is free, can be partially covered, and is vital for healthy living. Next slide, please. To 2021 and the journey into co-housing with this new initiative in Portaferry, we are excited to be involved in this project, Northern Ireland's first example of co-housing, learning from those that have gone on before, such as Lilac or Marmalade co-housing in England. The website is there if you're interested in connecting with them and learning with them as they go. And I'm being careful in terms of information because the process is in the early stages. But if we go to the next slide, we'll look at just a part example of it. So here we deal with the one element of rigor which just is completely absent in commercial housing. The roads are on the north side of the dwellings, and the front doors are all facing north, and the rears of the dwellings then all have a private south-facing garden, opportunity for solar, PV or thermal or whatever. And the rigor of an east-west orientation means that every single dwelling works on that basis. But from a planning perspective, planners will insist that back gardens face back gardens and fronts of houses face fronts of houses. And the simple question is why? An opportunity here exists to provide a potent demonstrator of how to rebuild community. It might not be for everyone, but the prospect of children being safe of older people having friends nearby, of the ability to walk to the shop, of the chance to eat together with other people 2 or 3 times a week in the common house, to have a properly orientated, ecological and energy efficient dwelling. Surely all of these should be aspirations for all of us. Next slide. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Marie, thank you so much. Lots of exciting innovation, lots of challenges as well as we think about what it is about why we think we've got to do what we've always done. So thank you for challenging us, and bureaucracy is a problem everywhere. So thank you very much. So over to you now who've been listening. If you have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A box if possible. I'm going to pick out, I'll ask our colleagues, the panelists, to put on their cameras again. And I will have one question that I've picked up from a chat, and then we'll go into the Q&A to get some of the others. So this one is from Niall Majuri, and specifically about habitats. So Jennifer, I'll allow you to take it. So it says, do affordable, scaled solutions to poverty housing necessarily have to come at the expense of agency and choice in shaping our domestic environments? How do Habitat's innovative practices and model of delivery seek to address this tension?
It's a good question. And much of Habitat's original work when we started was about building, housing ourselves. And much of what I shared today was about enabling the market to offer more choice so that people have agency, they have the information needed and the finance available so that they can make the choice that's best for their family and their situation, rather than saying that, all housing looks or feels this certain way. And I think most housing is in many of the global South countries is actually built in this more incremental way. And so we need to make sure that, yes, choice is available today, but make sure that there's also information that complements that well, so that people can build or improve their shelter in a way that's resilient, that's affordable, that's also meeting their own aspirations of their own family situation or their own work situation. So I think that that's the intention here, by moving as an organization towards a more market-based approach, which is more about being more of a facilitator. We're enabling that to come forward a bit more.
Thank you. And also I have a question specifically for Tom. How do you see the creative thinking of students contributing to sustainable innovation in the future?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I mean, I think that the great thing about working with my design studio is that the students who are working in that space are basically prototyping ideas that they will eventually actually undertake in practice somehow, and this goes kind of across the board. So there are the university is a kind of space within which innovation can occur, but particularly, and the thing I'm particularly interested in, and I think we are at Queen's in general, is how does innovation, how can you move from just an innovation space into a space which has agency and impact? And it's both coming up with the concepts and ideas around how challenges are addressed, but also being able to articulate how those might actually then be delivered in some form or another. And I think the interesting thing about the work that I showed today is all of it is based on an analysis of real situations. It's based on an analysis of the world as we find it, but it's positioning it within a world of ideas to allow us to open up new ways of approaching future development. And for sure, the graduates that come out of Queen's want to make things better. They want to change stuff. They want to have impacts, and they want to work globally. We've done amazing work with communities, not only in Northern Ireland, but much further afield, looking at how innovative thinking that comes out of the school can engage with the creative potential of communities. And this goes into innovative material practice. How do we use waste materials to produce something beautiful and inhabitable? I was working in a previous studio I was involved, which was looking at how do we connect shipping containers and handmade mud bricks to produce a primary school in a social community down in Argentina, in Rosario. It was fantastic. And that comes directly from the university and the design studio connecting with real places. It's brilliant, actually. I have to say, it's part of the reason I do it, because it's really fun.
Thank you. I suppose the question is, how do some of those innovative and amazing developments actually get to market and be scalable?
Well, I think there's a piece there about engaging with not only the physical manifestation of making something, but all the processes that are wrapped around that. Mm-hmm. The importance of understanding what the policy landscape is, the importance of understanding the social networks and economic drivers within a context, the ability to talk to multiple different people across those networks, and persuade and drive change is part of what we do. Being flexible and being able to bring people with you is part of what we look at. And then also understanding that the economics of building is complex and does depend on scalability. I mean, I was looking at the piece around modular construction. Modular construction has been on the table architecturally for decades, but it's difficult. You need to be big.
Yeah.
And so it's a difficult challenge.
Thank you. Thanks for that. A question for you, Mary. In what way does co-housing differ from rural social housing, apart from the fact that there was a common room shown in your plan?
Yeah, thank you. Good question. I think I would say, as an overarching, it differs in all aspects. So it differs in the approach to the site. It's a rigorous assessment of orientation and exposure and sunlight. I mentioned some of that in relation to the access roads. The common room is a vital core aspect of it, because the intention is that you would eat together 2 or 3 times a week. But in terms of the design part of it is one, but the economic structure of the makeup of the co-housing is the other big difference, which is that those who can afford more might have a slightly bigger house, but they can also subsidize the smaller houses in terms of ownership. And if you choose to depart, which apparently is a rare event, that the house goes back to the community, it doesn't get sold onto the open market. So then the house then is able to be intentionally repurposed, perhaps with those that are on the waiting list, or those that have expressed an interest or a family connection or whatever. So the process that they're going through at the minute is really effectively putting this out there, letting people be aware that this co-housing initiative is underway. They're bringing people to look at the site, to familiarize, and there's a degree of interview or conversation about, does this fit with the way that you live, and does it fit with your ideology, and is this something that you want to be part of? Because it did say it's not for everyone, but I think for a lot of people, it's just a beautiful reinvention of community.
Thank you. Another question, Jennifer, for you. Where have you seen governments most willing to create the kind of policy framework which promotes innovation?
So the Terwilliger Center is working through 5 labs right now, maybe a little bit different. They're basically in Philippines, India, Mexico, Kenya, and Peru. And I think that where we've found success, one of the countries that was probably the most interested was when we ran our Indian accelerator. At that moment in time, the government also decided to create a building materials accelerator that would support fast tracking innovations, hard tech, and also not just hard technologies, actually, I should say, into their system. So for instance, a 3D printing company or a project management app could get into the government system for socialized housing projects. And that fast track was actually a very interesting way of creating a direct line between, universities and innovators that are coming out of university systems or accelerators and into a formal environment. So I would say that we've seen these sort of promising practices amongst all of our lab countries. And that's actually, we've tend to base our labs in places where the government, the regulatory environment, and the private sector sort of are interested, or at this moment where we think that there's a lot of growth potential. So I would say that it takes patience to do sort of systems level work and to talk about regulatory environments. Building codes are often not changed. They're not changed every couple of years. It's a long consultative process as well. So it's about finding the levers in between. And as much as the formal environment is important, I think we've all 3 of us have talked about the informal social norms and elements as well that play sometimes equally as important of a role in terms of what works or doesn't work in terms of housing. So I'll just leave you with that.
Thank you. And an interesting question from Mira Siva. We spoke of ideas that did not go far, of heritage materials and methods. What has worked, and how can traditional be reimagined to be contemporary? For whomever would like to take that. And I just want to say that will have to be our last question. Any questions that haven't been answered, we will have our panel follow up and we'll share their answers beyond this session. But thank you. Go ahead. Sorry for that.
Well, I'll attempt to answer that one. It's kind of complicated, but I think one of the challenges and the part of the work we'll be looking at this year is around working with a place called Port Sunlight Village over in the Wirral in Cheshire. And what that place is, it's heavily protected by legislation, but it wants to come forwards and deliver net zero. So one of the kind of real questions, and I think it folds back into Jennifer's point about building regulations. We'll be looking at what is available right now in terms of advanced technology. We'll be looking at how that can be introduced into a heritage strongly constrained heritage environments in ways that are effective. And then we might be revisiting the notion of the regulatory framework to inform how that might be taken forwards in future, because one of the real challenges, certainly around the UK housing stock, is that it turns over about once every 90 years or something. So we're in this situation where large amounts of retrofit are going to be necessary, but also new housing is going to have to be introduced to address the deficit. So I can say that there are examples of successful heritage-based work. I think Port Sunlight will probably be one of them. And it's an ongoing conversation, because the other question is about what the language of contemporary is. You know, there's a very interesting thing looking at Port Sunlight. Well, when it was built, the houses were only supposed to be there for 50 or 60 years. You know, that was the original intention. Yet they're there 110 years later, and they're now protected statutorily, so they'll be there forever. So you know, how do we actually design within the kind of context of architecture in a way that will allow that shift in taste, the changes in how materials are kind of used? I think importantly, building for resilience and longevity is going to be important, you know. So quality, giving people quality. That's the
I think modular has worked, and it can work. So we do have outlets. We've got Fast House and Limavady that are currently or have completed sending lots of their cabins to Centre Parks in Dublin. But it's meeting that demand of that back to the holiday, you know, consumption of housing units. Well, why can that be not that tweaked to serve the single person accommodation? And for me, a big difficulty there is the whole procurement process and the complexity of bureaucracy yet again, which just kills the thing dead, and perhaps it's not glamorous enough.
Thank you, Murray, and thank you all. Thanks so much for joining us today for this, our final event in the One World Festival. The festival is focused on how we work together for a just, peaceful and sustainable world. And today's event highlights just how important innovation will be in building that sustainable world. I've certainly been inspired and challenged, and I hope that you have too. We'll be uploading the session to YouTube tomorrow, and you'll be able to watch it back or share with your wider networks if once was enough for you. You can also find out more about Habitat's work here in Ireland and around the world on our website or social media. So I would ask that you please do keep connected with us. Special thanks to our speakers. We really appreciated each of you. Your perspectives have been really interesting and as I say, also challenging. So thank you again, and thank you all.